During the pandemic, one of the more frightening abuses of power that we witnessed was governments wanting to enact isolation or quarantine camps for people suspected of having COVID-19. They didn't even have to prove you had COVID. They just had to suspect that you'd been exposed. And because of this possible exposure that you may or may not have had, they could force you to remain locked in your home or worse, in a facility or a camp. Now, luckily, their authoritarian ideas were challenged in court successfully. With us now is attorney Bobby Ann Cox, a New York attorney who recently won the landmark lawsuit against New York's Governor Kathy Hochul and her Department of Health for their unconstitutional isolation and quarantine procedures regulation. But shamefully, the governor and attorney general are now appealing Bobby Ann's victory because they want to retain the power to lock you up or lock you down at will. Bobby Ann, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you for having me on, Kim. It's great to be here.
So why is it that they're appealing this? First of all, let's get to the case itself and how you won, because a lot of these cases that I've seen over the last couple of years that are challenging these COVID measures and winning, they're winning on, I would say, aspects of the case that those of us just in the real world, non-attorney, non-legal people, they're not winning on the merits that we'd want them to win on. Like, hey, that's authoritarian, so you're not allowed to do that. Instead, it's like, well, it was the wrong agency that enacted or it wasn't fair because you didn't lock everybody down. So tell us this case and how it was won.
Yeah, absolutely. So last year, I brought a lawsuit against the governor of New York and her Department of Health. I'm representing in that lawsuit a group of New York State legislators. So Senator George Borrello, Assemblyman Chris Tague, and Assemblyman Mike Lawler, who now is Congressman Mike Lawler, together with a citizens group called Uniting New York State. And basically, we sued the governor and her Department of Health based on this regulation. And our claim was, look, you don't have the authority to make this regulation. You don't have the power as the governor or an agency beneath the governor. This is a power that's reserved for the lawmakers. This is a power that would go to the senators and the assembly members, not to the governor, right? This is not a monarchy. The governor can't just snap her fingers and get what she wants. So that was the whole premise of the case, was separation of powers. They were not abiding by separation of powers. But I do want to point out to your viewers what this regulation said. It was unbelievable. It gave the Department of Health the power to pick and choose which New Yorkers they could lock up or lock down. They could have locked you up in your home, or they could have removed you from your home with the force of police and put you into a detention facility of their choosing. You had no say where you went. And they could have held you there or locked you in your house for days, for weeks, for months. There was no time restriction in that regulation. And they could have done this to you, but they could have done this to your child or your grandchild or your elderly parent. There was no age restriction in that regulation. There was no way for you to get out once they put you in there, meaning there wasn't a procedure built into the regulation that said, for example, oh yeah, you can take a test, you could prove that you don't have COVID or that you don't have tuberculosis or, whatever other disease is on their list. No, you had to sit there at their whim and stay in lockdown or in lockup until they said that you could get out. I mean, completely unconstitutional. There was
And they could
no
take
due
your
process.
they could take your baby, for example. You say that there's no age restriction, so they could just say, you know what, your baby's been exposed, we're taking your baby away from you and someplace
No
else.
age restriction at all.
Wow. And no way to get out. So they didn't even bake that into this regulation. So
Nope.
you
So
you
we were
challenge
having,
this. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say we were having oral arguments in front of the judge last year at the trial court level. And the judge asked the attorney general's office, he said, okay, let's say you take a family and let's say you put them into isolation or quarantine in a facility somewhere, like a hospital, let's say. Once they're in quarantine, how do they get out?
And what was their
And
answer?
yeah, well, there was a nice long pause as the attorney general's representative thought about it. And then finally he said, well, I guess they could hire a lawyer and they could sue us.
Oh my gosh. That was their answer. It was hire
That
an attorney and sue us to get
That
out.
was the answer. Yep. And the judge said,
Wow.
he said, well, isn't that kind of a lengthy and expensive process? I mean, look, I mean, lawsuits take a long time, right?
And they're
Lawsuits don't
expensive.
happen
Yeah.
in 2 or 3 weeks, right? It's not the way it works. It was just unbelievable. You know, the court struck down the regulation as unconstitutional because it said basically the governor and the Department of Health breached separation of powers. But also, we have a quarantine law in New York State. Most states, if not all states, do have a quarantine law, but our law has many due process protections built in so that the citizen can't be abused by the government.
Yeah.
The number one thing that our quarantine law says is you first have to have the disease before you
Mm,
even go to step number two, right? So
right.
there's this whole process. There has to be an investigation, and you have to have an attorney representing you, and you have basically a hearing in front of a judge, and then the judge decides whether or not you should be put into isolation or quarantine. But not just if you have the disease, it's also if you have the disease and you're not protecting others around you,
Yeah.
right? Then they can issue the isolation or quarantine regulation order, and you can only be put into a hospital, right? This regulation that the governor made, they can stick you wherever they want to stick you. There's nothing saying they have to put you in a hospital, and there's no investigation, there's no hearing in front of a judge. It's literally just they feel like locking you up, they can lock you up. It's unbelievable. It's
So
unbelievable.
let's try to, just think from their perspective for a second. I know it's going to be difficult for both of us to do because it just sounds so insane. But um, okay, why would they want to make a new regulation? What was in their viewpoint wrong with the current quarantine procedure that you just laid out? Why wasn't that going to work from, let's say, let's give the most best faith answer we can come up with as to why they thought they needed to do that. What do you think it was?
So I can tell you exactly what they argued in their papers last year and now on appeal. They feel that they need the power, meaning the state needs the power to be able to lock people up or lock people down in the event of an emergency. And in fact, the attorney last year, when we were doing oral arguments, said, well, don't you want us to have the ability to control everybody if there's an emergency? We need to be able to tell you what to do. We have to keep everybody safe.
Yeah.
So their idea is they want to centralize the power. They don't want these individual local health departments or individual local municipalities, the mayors or the town supervisors. No, no, no. They don't want you to have the power. They certainly don't want it to be a judge having the power, because then you have to go through all these formal due process protections. They want the power to be given to them at the state level, and they want to be able to do it literally like with the flick of their pen.
Right. So they want it quick and they want the power at the top and they want to be able to do it fast. And the current quarantine law has a process. And so it can't be so quickly. So maybe the best faith answer that I could think of is they're thinking, well, a disease that spreads so quickly. So if one person gets it and within a day you've now spread it to tens of people, we've got to isolate you quickly. We can't wait for all of these. You get an attorney, you get all this stuff. We've got to just be able to. We suspect you've got it. We got to be able to throw you in, lock you into your home or someplace else because we don't want you to continue to spread it. So they're thinking like this is too fast moving. We've got to be faster than it if we're going to beat it, and so we've got to be able to have the power from the top, also to be able to do this. That's maybe the best faith, but of course, obviously that. Yeah, I mean, for one, we know in particular with this disease that didn't work. None of that was going to work anyway. Everyone was going to get it. So when you won in court, what was the merit you won on specifically?
So the court struck down this regulation mainly because it conflicted with our New York State quarantine law. So basically, with separation of powers, you can't have an agency or the governor making a rule that overrides or conflicts with a law.
Ah,
So
okay.
the separation of powers that we have, not just in the New York State Constitution, but in the federal Constitution as well, is that we have three branches of government: judicial, which is the courts; executive, which is the governor or the president at the federal level; and then you have the legislature.
Right.
So the legislature makes the laws, where the governor and her agencies are supposed to enforce the laws. They're not supposed to make rules that conflict with the laws. So that's what they did here very
Right.
clearly. And that's
Although
why the court struck it down.
they make laws all the I mean, they make executive orders, right, or new regulations all the time. But in order for them to get away with that, because we see like on the federal level, presidents making an unprecedented number of executive orders. It seems president after president, the number of executive orders keeps growing and growing. But they can only do this if what their executive order is does not conflict with an existing law.
Right. So regulations, which come from the executive branch, they come through the agencies. Regulations, they have to actually have a law that enables them. So it's called an enabling statute, or an anchor law. So otherwise, if you don't have that rule, you'll have agencies making up things that just whatever they want to say, whatever they want to order, whatever they want to do, they'll
Yeah.
just do it. That's not the way it works. The legislature has to pass a law, and that law can then enable the executive branch to make a rule or a regulation to help enforce that law.
Okay.
So in this case, there was no law that told them, that told the attorney general, I'm sorry, that told the Department of Health to make this quarantine regulation.
Yeah.
They did it because they just wanted the power.
My gosh. Okay, so now you won on that. Like I said, I wish the win was actually on you can't take people's rights away by locking them up indefinitely. I mean, maybe that would be another case that could be fought a different day. Would that have been possible? I mean, obviously, when you're taking a case to court, you have to pick what you're going to sue on. Could you have done it on this is ripping freedom away from people without due process?
Yeah, we did argue that as well. And the judge did make that part of his decision. His main reason for striking it down was that conflict between separation of powers. You can't have this power, basically, is what he said to the
Okay.
governor. And he also did note in his decision that this regulation lacked due process. You have
Okay.
to have due process protections built into the regs and into the laws. And so he did also mention that in his
Okay.
decision. And if people want to read the judge's decision, we actually have a web page that's specifically set up for this lawsuit, and people could check it out. You can actually go click the link and read the judge's decision. We also have photographs on that page, videos, interviews that I've done. There are social media flyers there that people can post on their social media to help
And
raise awareness.
what's the
And
website?
that's the website there is www.unitingnys.com
Okay,
slash
got it.
lawsuit.
Got it. And I'll have that link
So
down below there. I have that there. So, but wow, yeah. Okay, so they're now appealing this. What's their grounds for appeal?
their grounds for appeal is that they argue the judge erred, when he struck this down and declared it unconstitutional, because they're trying to say, their regulation doesn't actually conflict with the quarantine law. They're trying to argue that their regulation complements and
Oh,
clarifies the quarantine law. So, it's a pretty flimsy argument, in my opinion. I think it's pretty clear that those two things are in direct conflict with each other.
yeah.
Um, they try to argue that there is due process built into that regulation. Again, I can't see how they're making that a straight face argument, but that's part of their argument. So they're asking this appellate court, to overturn the judge's decision from last year. They want that power back. They want that regulation to be reinstated, so that they
Ugh.
can have this immense power. It's an unfettered power to
And you
do
know what
whatever
this
they want.
this also shows us that they plan for another pandemic. I mean, this isn't just the COVID pandemic's over. I mean, I see that some people are wanting to bring back some masks and there's some things here and there, but by and large, it's over. So this means they're wanting to use this power for a different pandemic. They're thinking we've got to have this ability. I mean, that's that's the scary part about it, is that many of us just want to move on with our lives after COVID. We want to put it in the rearview mirror and never think of it again. And they're saying, well, except we want to keep these powers that we were able to gain during the pandemic. We don't want to lose these powers. That's really, really frightening. So when does this case go to court again?
So we have oral arguments in front of the appellate division judges on September 13th. And
Okay.
that'll be in New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division in Rochester, New York. And it's a panel of judges. You know, the trial court, it's one judge, and now it'll be a panel. And we'll see what happens. I mean, they're going to have their chance to argue, and I'm going to have my chance to argue, and we'll see where the judges end up. But it's pretty scary, because if they do overturn that decision, if they give
Yeah.
them back this power, it's not only going to give them the power to lock people up or lock people down at will with no proof of illness, but it's also going to it's going to send a signal to other agencies, not just in New York, in other states, I'm sure as well, saying, hey, look, agencies, you can make whatever rules you want. You can make whatever regulations you want, even if they conflict with existing law, because look, we got away with it here in this case, right? So it's going to set a really bad precedent. It's very important that we retain our win at the appellate division. It really is.
Yeah. I mean, it's if geez, I really hope you do. I mean, I absolutely wish you the best of luck in this. But with New York and California, I'm in California, you're in New York. I mean, these states really abused their powers quite a bit during the pandemic and really showed their authoritarian sides. And we saw that in other liberal states as well. And I mean, the only thing I just was thinking while you were talking, I was thinking, maybe ultimately this ends up it has like a silver lining in some way, where the liberal states tend to be the most populated states. And so people are now fleeing, right? Like, I'm out of here. I don't want to live under these crazy laws. And they're moving to the more conservative, the red states. And so maybe this will kind of balance population out around the country, where people start moving to new places, like my home state of Idaho. We're seeing an influx of people moving to places like Idaho, moving to places like Texas, or, Wyoming. We're seeing all of these people moving around, and maybe it'll balance out the population a little bit. I don't know. That's because these things are really insane. So, Bobby Ann Cox, thank you so much for joining us with this. This is a frightening, frightening law. One of the more frightening, I think, out of all the laws that are out there during the pandemic. The ability to throw you in a camp is the scariest of all, I think, besides like forcing a medicine to be shoved into your body. Those two are fundamental rights that we should be able to have over ourselves. I should be able to say, no, I don't want you to inject me with something to make it mandatory, or I lose my freedoms. And I also don't want you to cart me away into a facility, a camp, or tell me I'm not allowed to leave my home. Those seem to be very fundamental rights that really slipped through our fingers during the COVID pandemic. They really showed themselves, masks off, right, during the pandemic. So, Bobby Ann, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on, Kim.